Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa. I'm Clarisse Fortuné, and these are the stories making headlines across the continent. Final day of COP29 climate summit, but still no final deal. A draft proposes rich nations to commit to pay $250 billion a year to poor nations to combat climate change. Developing nations are pushing for $1.3 trillion per year. The Algerian Press Agency confirms that French-Algerian novelist Boualem Sansal has been arrested by Algerian authorities, denouncing French support of the famous writer famed for free speech advocacy. And Kizza Besigye remains in detention. Ugandan opposition leader is accused of threatening national security. Meanwhile, his supporters are planning a mobilization, and we'll get the details. Today is supposed to be the final day of the COP29 summit in Baku. Representatives from nearly 200 nations are now awaiting a fresh proposal after 2 weeks of grueling negotiations. Developing nations want $1.3 trillion a year from richer countries to help reduce emissions and adapt to global warming. But the latest draft deal proposed just $250 billion annually, and there's been no visible progress on some of the other principal goals. Leo McGuinn.
After nearly 2 weeks of intense talks, COP29 entered its final day on Friday. The summit has been all about climate finance, money that wealthy nations are obligated to pay to developing countries in order to combat climate change. But after 11 days, there has been little progress.
Things are absolutely stuck. We are facing a deadlock, and there are deep divisions between parties. Clearly, developed countries have not stepped up. This is the last day of negotiations, and they have not even put a figure on the table. How do we negotiate? It's a negotiation in bad faith by developed countries.
Many developing nations have called for a figure of $1 trillion per year. They argue that developed nations should be the ones fronting that sum, as they are the chief culprits for historical emissions. But the so-called rich nations don't want to commit to such a large amount. Their budgets already exhausted by the recent pandemic and energy crisis. Draft text emerged on Thursday, angering the developing world by essentially leaving blank the financial commitments.
I think that's the frustration felt by many of the developing countries, particularly since there's been no number presented as yet by developed countries. So I think we're all anxious to wait to see if that will actually be presented in a new text.
A concrete number was finally proposed for the first time on Friday, with developed countries offering to provide $250 billion annually by 2035, a figure that is a long way off the $1 trillion asked for by developing nations.
And let's listen now to Mohamed Addo. He's the director of Power Shift Africa. He says this is the worst COP in recent memory, and for him, the draft proposal is unacceptable.
Our expectation was low, but this is a slap in the face. This is not something any developing country will fall for. We needed an ambitious climate finance goal that meets the needs of the developing country, and what they're offering us is a fifth of what developing countries have asked for. Will we settle for a fifth of the ambition that developing countries can provide? Of course not. And so there's no way this is going to be accepted by anyone.
A slap in the face, says Mohamed Addo, director of Power Shift Africa. We spoke to Tony Tiyu. He's the founder and CEO of Renewables in Africa, and he gave us his reaction to that statement.
I think I would agree with him, right? Because this COP, it was meant to be the COP for finance, and highlight the urgent need to transform global climate finance. You have vulnerable nations that were pushing for a new collective target, from the 100 billion that was actually running out by 2025 to 1.3 trillion, to address mitigation, adaptation, loss and damages. And what they're offering the developed nation is 250, which is just 1/5 of what is considered. Clearly, you can understand why people would consider that clearly unacceptable.
So countries vulnerable to climate change are asking $1.3 trillion per year. So how do we come up with this figure? I mean, what is, as far as African countries are concerned, what's for them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I can say that is actually worked out by people much more clever than me, so economists. And it's a complicated approach that would take into account scientific modeling, economic analysis, and also principle of climate justice. So we look at, for example, items like impact assessment. You want to quantify the economic losses from climate change in developing nations. You want to estimate the cost of extreme weather events, agricultural disruption, and infrastructure damages. And there's many other things that obviously come into that. You will look at, for example, also the adaptation cost calculation, where you want to determine the investment needed to make those critical systems resilient, and how can we move those economy from a fossil fuel base to clean energy base, and also what is the level of historical responsibility. You package all of that to come up with a 1.3 trillion. So that's what I could say regarding that figure.
So the negotiations are still ongoing in Baku. Do you know about the latest? What have you been hearing?
Oh, I think I could, like you could see in your previous report. So at the moment, there's no deal, right? So we need to have further conversations to move to hopefully a consensus. So I'm hearing that the new text could be talking about a higher amount than $250 billion per year, but recognizing what is actually needed is 1.3 trillion. And I know as well that developed nations, what they would like to see is to have a much bigger contributor base. They don't want to have the same few paying for that amount, which is obviously debatable. But they want to obviously invite people like China and India to make voluntary participation, which those countries at the moment say strictly no.
So the first COP was almost 30 years ago. Since then, there's one everywhere. We all remember the Paris Agreement that covered, you mentioned, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and finance. So many COPs. Are they still relevant?
That's an excellent question. That actually reminds me that I published an article like that in LinkedIn recently, and a friend of mine reacted to that and say, what are we waiting for? Are we waiting for COP 100? Why can't we solve the problem right now? But I would still argue that COP remain essential, right, for Africa to unify its voice and advocate for equitable climate solution. In fact, at COP, this is where you have global policy that are shaped, and Africa participation is needed to ensure that the needs are considered. But what we really need for those COP, and I think I would agree with everybody there, the sentiment, is that we need to be obviously translating those discussions into tangible outcome. So the focus must shift to accountability and implementation to ensure that the conferences really deliver results for vulnerable nations, because they are the ones suffering.
He had been missing since his return to Algeria from France on Saturday. Now, Algeria's press service has confirmed that French-Algerian writer Boualem Sansal has been arrested. A major figure in Francophone literature, he was also an outspoken critic of the Algerian regime, campaigning throughout his writing for freedom of expression and against the Algerian regime. Siobhan Silk tells us more.
Boualem Sansal was a relatively late-blooming novelist. Now 75, he was 49 when his debut work of fiction was published. Before then, he had been a teacher and a civil servant, living, he said, quietly and unknown. His first book, Le Sermon des Barbares, The Barbarian Oath, is a narrative of Algeria during the civil war of the 1990s. In his prize-winning work, Sansal hasn't hesitated to take aim at the highest political figures of that country, including sitting and former presidents.
In Algeria, my books were censored because they were full frontal attacks on power. I named names. I didn't use any aliases. I named them, Mr. Bouteflika, Mr. Boumediene, and so on. And I treated Islamism the same way. So, of course, I made a lot of enemies.
An atheist and proponent of science, Sansal has regularly written and spoken out against religious extremism. One of his works is set in a dystopian world taken over by Islamism. Sansal has warned of a growing Islamization of France, a position that's endeared him to some far-right leaders there. He has called himself a reluctant dissident and says he's blackballed in his country of origin.
Socially, I don't exist in Algeria. I'm not invited anywhere.
Sansal is now based primarily in France and was granted French citizenship this year in a ceremony presided over by President Emmanuel Macron himself. But the writer has continued to spend part of each year in Algeria. A week ago, he was detained upon landing at Algiers airport. The Algerian State Press Agency has confirmed his arrest, but it has not revealed what the accusations against him are.
In Uganda, opposition leader Kizza Besigye, who was arrested in Kenya and accused of threatening national security by military court, remains in detention. The UN has described the incident as an abduction and has called for the release of his opponent of President Museveni. On the ground, the opposition says it is planning a mobilization next week. Details from Clément Diroma in the region.
The party of Ugandan opposition leader Kizza Besigye, the Forum for Democratic Change, has called for a protest in Kampala on Monday, November 25th, to denounce the abduction and arrest of their leader in Kenya last weekend. Kizza Besigye, a longtime rival of Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, says he was taken from his Nairobi hotel and transported to Uganda, where a military court accused him of threatening national security and illegal firearm possession. The Kenyan government has denied any involvement in the matter, but has tasked the Ministry of Interior with an investigation amid growing criticism that it had failed to protect foreign dissidents on its soil. Meanwhile, Uganda's Minister of Information specified on local television that the arrest was indeed coordinated with Kenya. The affair has fueled renewed condemnation of Uganda and Kenya's record on human rights and international law. In July, Kenyan authorities deported 36 members of Besigye's political party to Uganda, where they were charged with terrorism-related offences. Kizza Besigye and his deputy are scheduled to appear before the military court again on December 2nd.
And now we end in South Africa with these images of a promise made to a dying mother. Terry February said he would find his brother's grave and bring him home. And after nearly 6 decades of searching, he has fulfilled that vow. The remains of his brother, Basil February, a South African anti-apartheid fighter who died in exile in Zimbabwe in 1967, were returned to his homeland in September. Basil has now been buried next to his parents and the family's grave. Basil's exhumation is part of a cooperative project between South Africa, Zimbabwe and Zambia to repatriate the remains of anti-apartheid struggle heroes who died in exile. And this concludes our edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to France 24.